All right. Thank you so much, Carl. Does that mean we can get started? What do you think? Yeah. As people trickle in, I think the first words that I'm going to say are not so important anyway. So welcome, everyone, to the fourth event of our public conversation series, Narrating Urban Lives, Theoretical Interventions in Global Urban History. My name is Kenny Coopers. I'm a professor of architectural history and urban studies at the University of Basel in Switzerland, and I'll be moderating today's discussion on the topic of world making. But first, a few words about the series. This series of public conversations reflects on what histories count or should count when narrating urban lives in a planetary age. And in doing so, this series wants to question dominant narratives to think through the political stakes of history as a plurality of practices and projects. So some of the questions that we hope to address and that we have also already addressed in some of the previous events is what ways of knowing and being undergird historical narratives and their temporal and spatial structures. How do ecological crisis and planetary consciousness inflect the way we understand urban life, worlds, and politics? And these kinds of questions frame an interdisciplinary discussion between urban historians and others who identify differently, with the aim of advancing histories and theories that can do justice to the plurality of urban life, again, in a kind of planetary or global frame. Previous events in this series include one on planetary histories of the city. We also had an event on archival futures to think critically about what it means to engage with archives in the stories we tell. We had an event on urban undersides, and the event, or the last one that is to come in the series, is entitled Critical Temporalities. This series is a global urban history project collaboration with Critical Urbanisms at the University of Basel, as well as Utadu African Cities Workshop in Nairobi, as well as the Urban Institute or Urban Studies Institute, in Antwerp, and the Beyond Inhabitation Lab at the University of Turin. And it's been organized by Hirete Block, Anwesha Ghosh, Wangoi Kimari, Carl Nightingale, Rosemary Wakeman, and myself. Now about today. Our goal today is to explore how the notion of world making, which has perhaps been most prominently articulated in literary studies, or first in literary studies, can help us to build alternative histories and theories of the global urban or the planetary urban. We'll talk about terms, I hope, in a bit. This event features speakers whose work foregrounds the making of worlds from connections and processes and peoples rather than other than those in Euro-American accounts of imperialist globalization. And before I introduce the speakers, I just want to briefly give the word to Carl to plug a couple of announcements.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Carl Nightingale, and I am co-coordinator of the Global Urban History Project. Just wanted to add two contextual things. One is that you can look at the recordings of all previous events, and I put the channel, our channel, GupVids as it's called, in the chat. You can also look at our website, and there's a direct link from the web page. Secondly, one of the things that we're hoping will come out of this is inspiration to you all to think about panels and conversations, further conversations and panels. We can have more of them online pretty easily. And if you have things that you want to talk about and you have people you want to talk about them with, we can help to make that happen. And pretty much, this can happen pretty spontaneously if you'd like. And so think about that. The other thing is that we will be announcing publicly a conference that we'll be holding, in-person conference we'll be holding in Berlin, Germany in July of 2025. And so we hope that these events too will, just a second here.
But I don't know how to.
We hope that the conversations we have here could lead to actual panels and so on. You'll hear invitations about that shortly, especially once we wrap up with the Narrating Urban Live series. That's all I have to say. Look forward to hearing the speakers.
All right, thank you so much, Carl. And now a brief introduction of the speakers today. And I'm not going to be able to do justice to the depth of their scholarship in this very brief introduction. So I'm going to copy their profile pages in the chat so you can have a look at them. Kaisha Corinialdi, is an interdisciplinary historian, author, and educator who specializes in 20th century histories of empire, migration, feminism, and Afro-diasporic activism in the Americas. She's an associate professor of history at Emerson College and the author of Panama in Black, Afro-Caribbean Worldmaking in the 20th Century. Preeta Meyer is an associate professor of African and Indian Ocean art and architectural history at NYU. She's the author of Swahili Port Cities, The Architecture of Elsewhere from 2016, and Almost Out, The Surface of Things, A History of Photography from the Swahili Coast. And Michael Goebel, I hope it's okay if I do this in the American pronunciation. His main research interests lie in histories of nationalism, of migration, and of cities in the 19th and 20th century. And he's a professor at the Freie Universität Berlin and at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. His book, Anti-Imperial Metropolis, Interwar Paris and the Seeds of Third World Internationalism, explores the question of why and how interwar Paris became such an important site for the global spread of anti-colonialism. And that's also the reason why we invited him, even though his work has significantly moved on from that. And perhaps he can also bring that in to the conversation today, of course. All right. Then very briefly about the format of this event. This will be quite a structured conversation divided into two blocks. A first block we will devote to the question of what is world making and what does it do in scholarship. And the second block is how does world making advance theory for our urban age? So these two blocks, each one of them is also, again, quite structured in order to prompt a more conversational format. So what we'll do is we'll have 5-minute input statements from each of the speakers in response to these questions. And then there will be a conversation between the speakers. And then in the third instance, we open up to Q&A from the audience. So we'll do that twice, and then end up with some concluding remarks in the last 10 minutes. And we should be promptly finishing at what is here, 7 p.m. All right, so I think we can get started with our first set of questions. I'm just going to prompt them and also put them in the chat. Second. What is world making to you? What analytical perspectives does it open up in your work? And what is at stake in this notion? What are the larger stakes? Perhaps Kaisha, Michael, and then Preeta can take 5 minutes if that order is okay for you, and then we'll get into a conversation. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you again for the invitation, Kenny, and for all those involved with the Global Urban History Project. In thinking about what world making means to me, its analytical uses, and also what's at stake, a couple of things come to mind. The first is that for me, world making is a way to localize global history. One of the things that I emphasize a great deal in Panama in Black is really trying to give readers a dive into a particular place. So at the end of reading it, my hope is that there's a clearer understanding of Panama City, of Colón, of the Canal Zone, of Brooklyn, in ways that are very, very specific, but also alluding to the connections that these places have to each other and to other parts of the world. And so that idea of grounding and localizing the global for me is really essential in thinking about it. also is the idea of centering people. One of the things that was always a tough battle in graduate school and beyond was the idea that sort of theory would be applied to a place, to a people, to an event. When what I found was that there are already ways in which people are theorizing their lived realities, their life histories. And so in this way, for me, it was really about thinking of through these newspapers, through school curriculums, through other formats, how were people specifically thinking about their role in the world? And for migrant communities and the descendants of migrants, this can be especially important because there's often a move to not necessarily center their voices, especially depending on whether or not you have particular nationalist narratives that simply refuse to recognize their existence, which is very much connected to how I, in the book, really think about world making as a direct challenge to xenophobia. One of the things that I point out is that for Black Panamanians, especially those with ancestry from the English and Caribbean, there becomes a necessity they're constantly being told that they have no in Panama. They're being told that the English Empire recognize them because they're no longer in the English Empire. And then they're also being told within the Canal Zone, which is controlled by the United States, that they have no rights or privileges to this space. So what do you do in these circumstances? You have to think about the world in your own terms. And you've got to teach about it, write about it, and be in conversation with other people who face similar challenges of exclusion and at times direct threats to their well-being, and together imagine a world that is tangible, both in the specific, hence why I focus on particular places, but also the potential of alliances that cross nation-state borders.
Thank you so much. Michael, would you like to add?
Thanks. I'll go back to your initial prompt. And so as a way of explaining why I think, much less specialist in how this term of world making is being used or should be used than Keisha, for example, is. So as Kenny said initially, my qualification for being invited here was this book that was published in 2015 called Anti-Imperial Metropolis, which was about anti-colonialism in interwar Paris, and which was much about the daily lives of people who in the literature had often been treated as intellectuals, but many of whom I treated more as labor migrants, who then became important carriers of political organizations that promoted anti-colonialism on a global scale, and ultimately anti-colonial nationalism also. So nationalism was there on the horizon. Now, this book came out in 2015, and in it, I never spoke of world making. I think I had been aware of the term vaguely. There was some larger research project around here in Berlin where art historians, I think, used the German variant of the term in order to acquire funding. I really only saw it with Adam Gattich, right? And I think that's why this term is so much associated with the way that Adam uses it. That I forgot, being able to imagine other ways of using it now. And since I've moved to doing completely different things, I'm now writing a history of Black homeowners in 19th century Buenos Aires, which is very much an economic history, right? And so it doesn't really figure there either. Now, the question I asked myself in response to Kenny's prompt is, would I have used the term in 2015 had I been able to read Adam Gattich's book then? Probably yes, just because it's become such a prominent term, and because the things that I talked about in that Paris book were very much about the everyday ways in which the people I looked at made sense of their quotidian surroundings and then projected that on a larger global anti-imperial scale, let's say, right? So in that sense, I think the term would have fitted very well with Adam Gattich's use, who's much more of an IR scholar, right? And I think who uses the term very much to gesture to nations of rearrangement of global rearrangement of sovereignty that are not necessarily national. This, however, is then the specific point where probably in terms of argument, I would have taken a slightly different tack, because my argument very much was, and I think continues to be, that there's a reason why so many of these movements ultimately took on a national form, let's say. Right. So I probably would have engaged with these debates. I'm sure I would consistently have treated my protagonists as world makers, in the sense that Adam speaks about them.
Great, thank you. That gets us started very nicely. Preeta.
I actually would like to share some images, since I am trained as an art and architectural historian. I'll just use I think the share screen prompt, okay?
That should work, I hope.
Oh, no. It says disabled screen sharing.
Right. Carl has an idea, I think. Rita is the host now, so I think it should allow you to do it.
Great.
Yes, we see it. Or I see it. I think everybody does.
You see it? Great. So very briefly, I work and have been working on Swahili Coast port cities for the last 20 years. I think of, and really the social and lived experiences of the built form and the material cultures of port cities. I'm especially interested in asking questions about or how port cities in fact force us to question how we use national and ethnic boundaries to talk about our sites and the objects we study. For example, why do we frame the studies of cities using ethno-territorial terms that are also racialized, like African, American, or Arab, or Asian? And I'm particularly interested in looking at the sort of counter world imaginaries or world-making projects that are really instantiated from port cities. In some ways, I've been most dedicated to the Kenyan coastal port city of Mombasa, because it also, again, makes us question sort of national narratives of belonging and unbelonging for centuries, but certainly also since the post-colonial period, because my primary method of my primary research method is historical ethnography. That is, I spent many years interviewing mostly elders about their sense of what the meaning and significance is of urban form and the old part of Mombasa, that is Mombasa Old Town. And in my conversations, and also, of course, in my first book on this, what always comes to the foreground is that, in fact, Mombasa troubles how we use the imperial moral map still today in relationship to how we categorize or think about lived experiences, including urban lived experience. Again, where does Mombasa belong? In fact, port cities refuse to be anchored to continents and ethno-territories and nation states, which always challenge us, therefore, to ask us what the geopolitics are of our scholarly projects, including how we map cities and define cities and the politics of naming. Again, because I'm very much interested and devoted to lived experience and also the relationship between the materiality of cities and daily lived experience. I very much move away from the macro scale of analysis of cities, but really am interested in the daily stories, the daily narratives anchored in specific places. For example, one of my chapters in my book on Swahili architecture focused on the very contested, constant reinterpretations of these two particular small mosques in Old Town, and in fact, how competing narratives of where Mombasa belongs in the world are anchored in these spaces. I won't go into much detail about what those contestations are. They, of course, also have to do with the fact that Mombasa became deeply embedded in the colonial project, and architecture was also racialized, and so were these mosques. But nonetheless, locals have a very different understanding what the form and meaning of these mosques are in relationship, in contrast to how colonial or even post-colonial heritage projects seek to produce sort of a racialized or identitarian narrative around these spaces. I'm very much devoted to focusing on what I would call the materiality of world making in or of Swahili port cities, how the material culture of the city itself, including mobile objects, create particular spaces, that is, for example, interior architectural spaces. And Kenny, this is for you because you know how much I love this photograph. How, for example, the world is collected in spaces like this. Why was and is Chinese export ceramics absolutely essential to the world that people are crafting in their homes in a port city like Lamu, that is now part of the coastal section of Kenya? So, of course, when you look from the framework of the colonial remapping and re-envisioning of port cities, race making fundamentally transforms how people identify and also even how the city is conceptualized as distinct racial neighborhoods. But mostly I'm interested in how material culture exceeds those racialized categories, and even those ways that citizens or coastal peoples who are now part of this nation state of Kenya in some ways refuse the way that identity and national identity is placed upon them. So I'm particularly interested in the way, for example, certain monuments become flashpoints of trying to narrate a different communal belonging. For example, for Bajuni people who once lived in the northern and still live under siege in many ways in the northern regions of coastal Kenya, close to the border to Somalia, often use ancient monuments that they say are the markers of their city building, refuses and exceeds the way that the nation state of Kenya seeks to narrate post-colonial citizenship. And that Bajuni or more Indian Ocean-oriented sense of citizenship is always about connecting to other cities across the sea. And so is that architecture connected to that narration. These are always narrated as very much moving beyond the physical territories of the nation state of Kenya. Stop there.
Great. I think this gives us a very good starting point to think about what world making is and what the stakes are in your scholarship, the centering of urban lived experience, but also anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, the tensions of nationalism and territorial belonging, etc. Just naming a few. To give you some time to reflect on correspondences. So what we'll do in the next 15 minutes, Kaisha, Michael, and then Rita would be to reflect on each other's statements, and then we'll open to questions from the floor, virtually. Kaisha.
Yeah, so great observations by both Michael and Prita. And I think that for me, when I first thought about how am I thinking of world making, I was especially wary of some of the area studies and international studies approaches, precisely because they often focus on a very select elite who sort of had the kind of mobility, who had the kind of access that most people did not have. The people that I study still were themselves sometimes the first in their family to finish elementary, secondary school, sometimes the first to engage in labor organizing. And that for me was really important to highlight, right? That there is often a lot of focus on, let's say, the work of Fanon, right? But I was like, well, who can tell me about some of the feminist organizers in Panama, right? Like Leonard Jump, right? Like people like Westerman, Sidney Young, who are creating these newspapers that were really instrumental in connecting people to one another. So I wanted to think about messing up a bit with a sort of nation state and also elite centered approach to engagement in thinking about world making. And that's where, Rita, when you were talking about collecting ethnographies from elders, really, really stood out to me, because that was a good portion of the project and that I really most enjoyed. And I talk a lot about this particular group based out of Brooklyn called Las Servidoras in the book. And really the only way that I was able to write that chapter was through elders who sort of guided me in thinking about, I knew that there's a Panamanian community in Brooklyn. I started the project in Panama City, looked at the Canal Zone, ended in Brooklyn. And I purposefully ended in Brooklyn because this was an opportunity to highlight this history of world making that was just not available anywhere else. There was no one talking about this organization and what it had done, with the exception of, one or two scholars that had written about it in Panama. And so it was available, an article or two in Spanish, but nothing really connecting it to this dynamic work of building new communities, creating alliances. And so without taking the time to explore and sit with people who had kept these documents for decades, right? So these were the nieces of the founders, right? So not even the founders themselves, but who had kept the records and were very intentional in wanting to make sure that the organization continued, even as it evolved, was really fascinating. And the last thing I'll add, also connected to the point that you made, Preeta, about port cities. I think it's so, for me, thinking about spaces like Colón, an isthmus, right? Like if you think about an isthmus and how it is surrounded, right, by coast on every way, it means that you do get in these spaces ideas and movements and traditions that challenge the status quo. And that is why I argue in the book that you have such intense xenophobic attacks against these groups, because they are precisely an embodiment of what is possible when you have people in communication with one another, when you have people challenging a narrative of one language, one nation, in this way that something about the port really, really allows, that doesn't happen necessarily in other spaces. So in hearing that, I was like, oh yes, this makes absolute sense. And to sort of think about it, in your case, you're thinking of Kenya and many other spaces along the Swahili coast that have that, but I saw so many reverberations to being defiant about saying this is necessarily, in your case, part of Kenya or even part of Panama, right? There's a way in which you talk about Colón, you talk about sort of Portobello, these areas in very specific ways that challenge attempts at making it a nationalist project, even as we know that the nation state is there, right? It never goes away, it's always there. But there is something that's happening in these kinds of spaces that creates a dynamic conversation and confrontation that I think is really wonderful to see play out.
Thank you. Micha, do you want to add something?
Yeah, maybe I'm trying to think about how to formulate it as a question, right? Like I said earlier, I was a latecomer to the term when the book was out. I hadn't used the term. Then I thought, you know, what to do with it now if I ever came back to this and so forth. And I guess one of the questions I had and have, and maybe I can formulate this as a question to Keisha and to Peter, is about the about the geography of the scholarly use of the term, right? To put it so. So for instance, like I was looking at people, activists, anti-imperial activists, people who initially were not, some of whom were not initially very politicized, but you know, who because of certain issues relating to their colonial metropolitan migration became politicized and then became political activists. And so I was looking mostly at people from different parts of the French Empire, right? Whereas Adam Gattachu obviously is more of an African diasporic book. And I was thinking, yeah, I can see, for instance, right, with if I compare my West African and Antillean activists in Paris to the Vietnamese activists, how for the Black activists, essentially, it is a lot harder to trim their imagined demographic unit of belonging, which is racial, into a contiguous territorial nation state than it is for the Vietnamese, right? So let's say the nationalist solution for the Vietnamese. And I wonder then, you know, does this relate to the geographic scholarly use of the term? Like, is this a term, for example, that's more interesting and more widely used for Africanists or people who work on the African diaspora than it is in Asian contexts? I don't really know.
That's a good question, and I would wish we had an Asianist here to help us answer it. But I guess, Kaisha and Prita, what are your thoughts?
I mean, I also don't know the the context of how it's used in Asian or Asian area studies disciplines, but and this is also in many ways in response to Keisha's comments. You know, in many ways, of course, you know, Worldmaking After Empire, that important book, in some ways brought the term very much front and center because it's such an important intervention in so many disciplines. But, you know, and that book is really so profoundly paradigm shifting. I think that we're all still in many ways grappling with and inspired by the after effects of her intervention. But what's interesting to me, and what's also in some ways has to do with my method, and of course also a similar method of Kaisha's, is that if I look at how she engages, what archives or what speech acts she engages, they are still very much the world of, you know, the elite, of the metropolitan elite. And she focuses on texts and, you know, and sort of does also an analysis of the discursive power of the texts of the political science theorists and anti-colonial and Pan-Africanist theorists that she's interested in. And I guess I'm most interested in, let's say, a world making from below, or from, you know, the subaltern or the everyday, which of course one could also say that comes more naturally to people trained in Africanist studies or African diaspora studies. You know, each discipline of course also has its own sort of preferences of method, but I'm more perhaps most interested in, and also to ask a question maybe similar to Michael, for all of us to think about. I mean, what is the difference, or how, you know, the term world making is so capacious. You can also almost make it do anything you want, which is, I guess, all good academic concepts work like that. You know, one question could be, what is the difference, you know, and I also thought about this as I was preparing for our engagement today. What is really the difference between what work can the concept world making do for us that is different from the work that, let's say, the concept of the imaginary or worldly imaginaries have done for scholars in the past, you know? I do think it's not by accident that both of those terms or concepts, the imaginary, imaginaries, world making, come out of, you know, as Kenny rightly pointed out of literary studies, and then have been cannibalized, or to put it less negatively, reimagined, if you will, and in other disciplines. And just for me, being so invested in the materiality and the physicality of built form, I'm always interested in how we can think about, you think about concepts like imaginaries, world making, communal, visions that are not anchored in just speech acts and written texts. I'm interested in the materiality of it. There's something, about a building, a photograph, and objects that exceeds a certain, sort of narration that we're used to applying to our objects of interpretation when we think of things as discourse or written words or speech acts.
Great. And I think with that, we can open up to questions from the room. Please speak up directly. I think that's how we can do it, right? We're a small enough group to do that. And in the meantime, while people are preparing their questions, I can really come up with one myself to fill the space. And that is what you think about this genealogy of the term. I think it was already mentioned, literary studies, etc. But we can, of course, think about a much broader kind of historiography of this. If we think about globalization from below, I'm thinking about this book by Linnebo and Rediker, I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, The Many-Headed Hydra. And other works that are perhaps more rooted in, social history, labor history, history from below, as, back 1960s, 70s. So, if we can maybe map some of that from these different perspectives that you're all coming from. You can also leave that question as is and field a few more from people. Alexia, maybe since you have popped up.
Yeah, I can ask a question.
Yeah, please.
Thank you to everyone. It was just actually, this is a question specifically for Michael, who's trying to run away from the term world making in his presentation, which just to maybe ask you to say a little bit more about what do you think, if you're thinking of your new work as an economic history, or more linked to economic history, do you think there's an antipathy there between some of these more, I really like how Prita said, right, and it had been occurring to me as well, right, this term of imaginary, the way that people are imagining and trying to, and this is why I think actually the term world making is a good one, right, in terms of the emphasis on making, as well as imagining. Of course, we all know that imagining happens through many material supports, etc., but the making of it is also good. But that's a digression into, do you think the economic is in some way, I don't know, antipathetic to thinking about the world making in this way, or do you think it's just other ways of thinking about how maybe money or property is moving in your story is just more useful for you in terms of thinking about these connections? And then maybe a second one for everyone would just be to rephrase Kenny's question and to say, yes, of course, if we have Linebaugh and Rediker on sort of the global from below, what is the place of the city? Because they don't have cities. Though I'm sure they have things to say about cities, not to assume.
Great question. Thank you. Shall we, unless there's another one coming from the audience right now, Rosemary? Please.
Yeah, I hope you can hear me. I think I'd like to build on Alexia's last question and ask where the city fits into this, or perhaps the urban. I can put it that way as well. I also wondered, what is the relationship between world making from below, as you've described it so well, and the reality of it might be religious identity, for example, gender identity, class identity. all of which are constructed within the context of local collectivity, right? They may be part of a national agenda, but the way people actually experience those identities can be very local and can be very material, to speak to Preeta's question. That they may appear in song, for example, and festivities in a wide variety of activities that may or may not be captured at any level other than the local, but still constitute a world making around religious, social, collective identities of gender, etc. So I'm thinking about that in particular because that's where you, in my mind, you see the intersection with the city. These world-making identities are constructed within the context of space, within the context of architecture, within the context of cultural collectivity that is worked out in the city, on the city streets. So I'll leave it at that. But that's what I'm focusing on, is where the city fits into this world making and its relationship to constructed identities that have been built over time. Thanks.
Thanks, Rosemary. There's space in everyone's head for one more question, and then please go ahead.
I had an article last year in Urban History with a co-author that looked at the Bedouin communities in southern Palestine as they networked across and all the way across to Cairo, across down to Aqaba, up to Amman and Jerusalem, and looking at the Bedouin as using that urban space and then creating the networks and the connections and providing the frameworks for an urban world. And then, of course, there were layers beyond that. The minute that the Bedouin produced barley to sell in Gaza, it was sold in Britain to make beer, and things that the Bedouin produced were sold and interacted all the way across to Damascus and down to Mecca. And so they created an urban world, and it had edges and it had layers beyond it and connectedness, and very much in their imaginary. And so both of these fit with the port city question and so on. So I prefer, and I like the concept of urban worlds and of urban world making, as people make the worlds from the bottom up. And then you get, of course, the problem of empires and the Ottomans and the British and the Israelis and everybody else trying to divide these territories. And so they continue to work. After 48, the Israelis were upset because the Bedouin continued to smuggle and develop and across into Hebron, across to Cairo and so on. What do you do about this, if you're trying to impose sovereignty? And so I think it's a useful concept, but I see it more as developing urban worlds. I've also got some work coming out this fall on carceral urban worlds. And I think we can designate certain urban worlds in terms of characteristics, their carcerality, for example, that is different and it has edges and it's not the same as other urban worlds.
Thank you. I think that's a very good plug also, and feel free to enter your link to the article you mentioned in the chat, and for everybody to do the same. I think this can be a collective fielding also of relevant work. Okay, so we have a lot on the table here. Economic history, the genealogy of the term, class, gender identity, as Rosemary was mentioning, and then this notion of urban world making. It's a pick and choose, I think, since we can't possibly address all of this systematically. And feel free to speak up directly, or Kaisha, otherwise we can stick to this circular movement if you want.
Sure, I'll jump in. So many rich questions and also offerings. Thank you all. I was very much struck by Alexia, your emphasis on the making, that's part of the world making, because that for me is what makes the term powerful and useful. and also considering a kind of decoupling of world from an area studies approach to really thinking about how worlds are made at the communal level, at the individual, even citywide level, that allows for possibilities that are not solely connected to the need for a nation state or the need for recognition of sovereignty, right? It does sometimes come into conflict, but there is something that it allows, that idea of the possible making that's really at play. And as I was thinking of Rosemary, your question about the specific ways that religion, class, gender could also be tied back to cities and how we're thinking about whether it is urban worlds or urban world making. I begin the book by looking at this park that is constructed in Rio Bajo in Panama City, a working class neighborhood. And I begin with that park because it's named in honor of sort of the founder of one of the longest running newspapers in Panama, created by the Caribbean community. And what I love about the park, and there's a particular image that I use for it, is that it allows us to see the materiality of how this world is made. In the park, you see children, you see the people involved in donating to the park, you see writers connected to the newspaper, and all the things that were not planned, in that photograph, right? The idea was to commemorate the moment, but you see the little kid running past, you see a couple of people staring on, you see very much how this park now is a world of its own. This is going to be a space that is going to be remade over and over again by this particular working class community that advocated for it to be built in their specific space to fulfill their interest in not only highlighting this member of their community, but having something that was concrete, right? Something that was of the community, for the community, and allowed for other types of events and thinking to take place there. And so when I think about what does it look like, and hence that push to materialize some of this imaginary, sometimes it's a thing like a park, right? That you can go to and it's connected to someone's name, but it's also very much a place that's going to take on a life of its own. It's a neighborhood that becomes its own, right? There is a little Brooklyn in Panama City, right? And a Panama City in Brooklyn. And that's only possible because of how the people in those spaces made those spaces that world. And so thinking about those connections for me is really fruitful, and that they're going to be sometimes ideas or people that we don't always get to fit into the frame, but this idea of making it anew, of looking at a home, looking at a park, right, as a place of dynamic conversation and creation is for me what's so fruitful in this kind of work.
Thank you, Kasia. Michael or Prita?
All right. Yeah, thanks so much for the two questions, and I'll stick to Alex and Rosemary's. But let me just say, so first of all, I completely agree with Prita. Like with every very successful concept, there's a danger of, let's call it imperial overstretch, right? It becomes so capacious that so what I do think is we need an answer to the question, what are where do we want to draw the line? What kinds of things do we definitely not want to call world making? And if we don't have an answer to this, I think it shows that we are running the risk of the term becoming so capacious as to be meaningless, right? Now, and to some extent this has happened, right? So we have this grad school in global intellectual history, which is intellectual history. There, the doctoral students use it a lot, and they fight a lot about over its use and whether it's useful to use it or not. There's a doctoral dissertation about dancehall music in 1990s, which has world making in the title, and dancehall becomes an instance in 1990s London of world making, which isn't wrong. but I guess the question you have to ask yourself is, what does it add to the argument or to the prism or to the lens? And there I'm sometimes not entirely sure. And this goes to answer your first question about economics, right? So I do think the term is much more used in intellectual and cultural history as it comes out of literary studies, certainly not by economists. The history that I'm writing now is, as you know, has a sort of fairly quantitative inclinations, but that doesn't mean that certain ways in which people imagine their lives, right? So what kind of relation do people have to the concept of property, to their actual buildings? How important are they as family homes? What do they think about hereditary lines? When an Italian consul speaks about transnational laws of property inheritance, should I call it an instance of world making? I guess I could, right? But the question always is, what does calling it that tell me that I couldn't see without using the term? And so I think that goes partly to Rosemary's second question, which in Adam Gatichew's example, for example, that she's writing a history of the ideas of famous intellectuals, essentially. Which is fine and legitimate, right? It's clearly not an urban history. She never thinks about it in that way. And so I think in general, the term actually probably less used in urban history as a field than it is in, let's say, intellectual history and other fields in general. I do think there's, like you intimated, if I understood you correctly, there's an interesting issue here. So for instance, intellectual history, right, is a kind of history that mostly takes place in cities without the authors explicitly saying so. Because where does W.E.B. Du Bois write something? It usually happens to be a fairly urbanized space, right? So can we as urban historians make a case for the intrinsically urban dimensions of intellectual instances of world making? Maybe.
Great provocations. Prita, these are all on you.
Wow. Okay. I won't be able to do justice to all of these multiple questions and provocations. Just thinking out loud, also in response to what Michael just said, perhaps one of the conceptual, usefulness of world making, besides the one that has already been identified by Keisha in the beginning, or actually one of the people who asked the question, is the emphasis on making, right? That is, I think it is, in many ways a potential, a potential critique on the focusing on just, imaginaries and claims and, and the sort of the, and I do think world making gets at something a little bit more ineffable than, if we read texts and major publications by famous thinkers, right? I guess also, although I think it would be interesting to think about what's the difference between world making as a thought and world making as an embodied practice in a specific place. And to Michael's point, but also really just preliminarily thinking about this, and so this is very, very much my thinking in process, is I guess one of the really important insights about sort of the rise of thinking with world making is that it forces us to think more carefully about what sovereignty means and is, in the sense that sovereignty is not just about, the Westphalian notion of sovereign nation states. That's how we usually think, and oftentimes we, sort of of course, well, maybe not everyone, but in African diaspora studies, if I can generalize, sort of the nation building is oftentimes, a negative space, this the nationalist project, the ethnocentric project. World making forces us, at least I think, also to think about sovereignty in a more quotidian way in terms of bodily sovereignty, right? Communal sovereignty. And that brings me to just briefly address some of the excellent questions. Port cities have always been sort of challenging national sovereignty, certainly with the rise of, sort of like in response to post-colonial nation building, and in the port cities of the Swahili coast are a thorn, you could say, in the back of the Kenyan national and nationalist project. And there's nothing more important to everyday people living on the Swahili coast to claim to belong to certain cities. You can claim rights bearing individuality or identity beyond the category of national citizenship if you can, if you anchor your sense of self in a city, a port city. Like there's a huge and of course, this is also not only a beautiful project of claiming. There's also a constant negotiation between claims of saying that other people do not belong to the city, right? Also by people, I've been told that I oftentimes heroize the coastal perspective, or let's say the perspective of Bajuni or Swahili activists. They're also rejecting others, from their conception of let's see, Wamijiness. And we claim port cities as their ancestry, right? And this also then brings up the issue of religious and gendered identity. The fact that port cities on the Swahili coast are Muslim cities, and the material culture of Islamic heritage, becomes a flashpoint of claiming alternative visions of communal identity. We are part of the Muslim world. This creates all kinds of anxieties for non-majority community. The majority of Kenya is Christian, right? So the way that sort of material culture of Islamicness is important, is deployed, becomes highly contested. But at the same time, the port cities, like, where's the urban in this, right? There's something very unique about, let's say, the physical layout, the way you move through Mombasa Old Town, right? And the way that women move through Old Town, the way that men move through Old Town. And there's always a sense that people who are the true Wamiji, that is the indigenous people of Mombasa, move through the city differently than newcomers. I'll leave it there.
Great. We have a lot on the table, and we have one question from Emilio, Cruz Brandao. Does everybody see that in the chat? I wonder if we do that now or keep that for the second block. Let's see. Let's give it a shot. So on the concept of world making, and I don't think it's such a beginner's question. At least I don't have an initial immediate answer to it. What's its relationship between or with the concept of worlding in the way Spivak uses it as a critique of the post-colonial act, or in the way that feminist theorists like Haraway use it in a more performative way? All right, so this is a theory question for sure. Anybody feel they want to give it a stab?
Since Emilio wrote the question, why doesn't he share his preliminary thoughts about how did he, why this question?
He's gone.
I'm
no,
here.
no, sorry.
It was two.
It's the other Emilio.
The same name. No, I'm connected from Sweden, and I'm a PhD student, so that's why beginners and still playing with concepts in a way. And I came across this concept of worlding. I work with action research and with communities in urban contexts, kind of constructing their own narratives or counter narratives in a way. And being action research, one of the first things we worked with was through, yes, exactly, conceptual terms and things like that. And that type of practice of conceptualizing community practices with their own words we came up with this idea of the worlding, and that was coming across the use of it or the transformation of it by Haraway, which is more looking at the performative of constructing of worlds as an act, whereas Spivak is more using it as a critique of how colonials in the post-colonial kind of formation build the narratives of the others through the voices of the colonial in a way. Well, I've been a bit skeptical of the worlding as a concept because it's also on the edge of being conflictuous in a way, but also because it's pretty hard to pronounce. And I think when it was one of the things that I saw when I saw the ad on this seminar today, this Worldmaking, which I found it like very interesting, being a new concept and talking about things on the edge as well. So that's why I was kind of just wondering if anyone here came across any relation or non-relation or reaction between these two concepts, or if they don't have anything to do with each other. So maybe it's pure speculative question.
I think it's a great question, but it's definitely caught some of us by surprise. Kersha, you want to give it a...
No, and I was just going to say that in thinking about the performative aspect that Harry is discussing, I definitely think about things like self-fashioning as another kind of framing that I think tries to do a bit of that idea of world, and that takes it more at the individual level. And so when I've encountered worlding, there's been more a focus on how it is at the individual. It is sometimes as a way of redress for a specific event, etc. And in thinking about how it compares with world making, the invocation of how it comes together, the practice of how it might have a city, how within a city you would have a newspaper, a school, various other spaces be necessary for the creating of this world. I'm not as sure the ways that those kinds of structures, that kind of active creation is viewed as necessary with things that are more individual, like self-fashioning, etc. But that's sort of my stab.
Thank you. And Bruce also has a potential or the gist of an answer. I don't know if you want to comment on that directly.
Well, the question just made me think about indigenous communities trying to live how they want to live to reclaim their future. Solar punk in cities trying to rebuild a kind of a less dystopian, positive future for themselves in local energy grids and so on. I think there's an awful lot of work at what I would call more local levels of people saying, I'm going to pull out and do what I want the future to be. And so that would be my interpretation of worlding.
Thank you. I don't know how that relates to Spivak's theories, but I like the very concrete way that you've defined it just now. Prita, do you want to add to that, or?
I mean, I would only say very quickly that this is always such a wonderful reminder that graduate students know so much more than old professors, because you're actually doing this fine-grained, close reading of scholars that we read, of course, also in graduate school, but our minds are a little bit fuzzy. But if I remember correctly, from worlding in relationship or coming out of the work of Spivak, but actually, Emilio, please do correct me, is that her sort of use of it was to point out that, as in contrast, that it was sort of an attempt, a way to move beyond a binary between sort of the the sort of like the universal and the indigenous, right? This is like that local global South ideas and practices are regional, local, provincial, right? That they are sort of so particular that you can't theorize or think out, comparatively with them, as opposed to, so that it's a project of worlding the local and the indigenous. That's my remembering of it.
Exactly. And that project being
is that right? Would I have passed that? Yeah.
No, but I think it's in line with my perception as well. I mean, it's of course, I mean, I can't speak through the voice of Spivak, but my interpretation is also that is pointing out as the classic situation of the world of the white saviorism coming into the context and trying to depict that context through or whatever the intentions might be. So that's the kind of, but I think that Keisha's contribution explaining this kind of possible differences actually grew my interest on the world making concept to explore a bit more. So I will read, I promise, I will read more on that. And as it is more connected from your description, is this the connection to the togetherness, which is the whole act that I try to explore also in my work. So that's in a sense becomes a more operative and more correct, I would say, term to use on the things that I explore in my work. So that's, I think, a thank you note for the seminar existence in itself for me. It's very useful. Thanks.
Thank you for bringing that in, and Michael, please also jump in if you want. But I think it also responds a little bit to your point to say that we really have to think more precisely about the term and what it does for us, right? So whether we think about world making as the alternative future, or we think about it as something from the margin, or we think about it as something from below, these are of course related maybe ways of thinking about it, but more precisely conceptualizing what we mean with those terms with the specifics of the empirical material that we're looking at and the histories, the specific situated histories that we're looking at. I guess that's the challenge. Other than that, I guess yeah, I really liked Bruce's very down-to-earth way of thinking from the various perspectives that we're studying, which also I think is the insistence of both Keisha and Prita in how you started with lived experiences, right? All right, so I think we can move to our second block, and we've already touched upon it briefly, and this is around the question of how accounts of world making advance theory for our urban planet. And of course, we can question what that means, our urban planet, but that just as a shorthand for thinking about the relationship between the urban and the planetary, the global. And yeah, I'll put that question in the chat, and I think we'll have some input statements first of just a few minutes. Michael, then Prita, and we'll go through the same format, basically. Thanks.
Sure. And I think this is great that we have that conversation about theory and the evolution of the term and its applicability just before this, because in thinking about what world making does that maybe differentiates it from other things or expands on it further, one thing that came to mind is that for me, being able to think about the making of worlds to describe places that no longer exist is really paramount. So the Canal Zone, which is an area that I discussed in the book, which is a US-controlled military area that separated the country of Panama into two sides. It included a number of towns which implemented segregation. One town was for white US citizens only. Other towns were for anyone who was not white and a US citizen. Those towns no longer exist. So if you go to Panama today, a lot of the buildings that were once in places like La Boca, like Paraíso, like Rainbow City, which were some of the segregated towns that I discussed in the book, those are not there. they've been erased. There's been a push once the canal was handed over to Panama from the United States to reclaim the land and the spaces and to sell and or rent various areas, but there was very little investment made in historicizing the places, the churches, the schools, the fact that these were communities where people lived and created worlds. And so for me, it becomes really paramount to center to recreate for those reading the text, like what this place was and why it meant so much to people, even as they lived under extreme conditions of discrimination, xenophobia, et cetera, to be able to point to that library that they would go to on Saturdays, to point to the concerts that they would attend, to think about how labor rights leaders were thinking about how they could implement greater access to employment for future generations, that this was a place that was their own. And this ties again to the idea that within this canal zone space, many for a very long time had no rights. They're not US citizens, they're not Panamanian citizens. And so it becomes really important to center this alternate way of framing and thinking of yourself. How do you teach a student when they're repeatedly told that they do not exist within geographical framings of the space? Well, you teach them that they're part of a wider network, a part of a network that has been engaging with these questions of freedom and belonging for centuries, that isn't connected to a particular nation state, but that is nonetheless vital. So that's one important condition. And I would say another for me is that world making and how it can be differentiated is that for me, it really pushes against attempts at presenting anti-imperialism as an inherently positive and non-problematic term, right? I see anti-imperialism being utilized, but the very anti-imperialism that plays out in Panama is one that is xenophobic, is one that discriminates against communities that are seen as not belonging, as not inherently having a right to that space. And so world making really challenges our sometimes attempts and desires to think about the anti-imperial and the anti-colonial without taking into account how those elites reproduce some of the very violences that they're accusing imperialist powers of engaging in. So white supremacy actually connects elites in Panama and elites in the United States, even as elites in Panama are advocating for this anti-imperialism. Is it anti-imperialism that is also asking for the erasure of entire communities? And so what does world making do? The way that I advocate that labor union organizers, teachers, and others are putting to the forefront is suggesting all of these attempts that you're seeing and seeing to present this as a nationalist narrative, especially when it came to reclaiming the canal, is on the back of our erasure, is on the back of assuming that we didn't exist, that we didn't actually collectively fight, that we didn't actually make this place what it is. And so wanting to really consider what we can do when we see anti-imperialism being brought forth, anti-colonialism being brought forth without that thorough engagement of who is advocating for this. And would it in fact not just simply reproduce the very kind of colonial power that they are claiming to be against in a way that still maintains their power base, right? So those two concrete ways, being able to highlight spaces that physically no longer exist, right? And how can we as historians take on that task as well, in addition to making us think and be more critical about sometimes attempts at romanticizing terms, et cetera, that have also had much more negative histories that are not as fully fleshed out, because I think sometimes the perspective has been, on rightly so, denouncing imperialist practices, whether it's by the French, the British, or the US, but in what ways do we then see an alliance between anti-imperialists and xenophobes and sort of racist thinkers and practitioners?
Wonderful. Michael.
Yeah, I'm afraid interpreted your prompt here very much in the same way as Rosemary's question earlier. So I shot much of my powder there. Let me try to add a few things nonetheless. And those are very much from a historian's perspective, right? And I realize not everybody here is a historian. So I'll start from a historian's perspective and then try to say something on the urban dimension. So first of all, it seems to me that world making isn't exactly a methodology or an approach in the way that historical comparison used to be, or transnational history might be, or global history is, right? It's by and large something that historians say the historical protagonists they write about engaged with in the past, right? So and I think that's perfectly fine. So it's something that so it's not me that is doing the world making when I write a book, but it's the people I write about who did the world making. But in contrast to anti-imperialism and a lot of other terms, it's not a source term. So it's not like my people in the 1920s were using the term very much. So it's something that I impute to them. Which I think is perfectly valid and fine. But again, I think it requires me to decide what I want to call world making and what I don't want to call world making. And especially on that second question, I'm sometimes a little bit less sure where the boundaries of the term are. Now, having said that, like anti-imperialism or anti-colonialism, it's not something, or let's say past imaginations of rearrangements of sovereignty, to put it in more abstract terms. It's not something that's intrinsic to urban history or anything urban per se, right? So I guess I struggle a little bit like Rosemary did earlier to link this specifically to urban history as opposed to all other sorts of history, unless we try to make an argument about how a lot of the intellectual history that is customarily around happens to be implicitly urban, and whether there's a case for theorizing this more explicitly than is usually the case outside of urban history. Sorry? But I'm finished anyway, I think. But I guess the basic problem I have is to link the concept to urban history in particular, as opposed to all other kinds of historical inquiry.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think this goes back to what was discussed before about the insistence on the situatedness of the actors, right? And that even Bedouin communities fabricate urban worlds, as Bruce was also mentioning. So I see your question implicitly answered already by Keisha and Preeta. But please, Preeta, it's your turn.
Thank you. Can I share my screen one more time?
Of course. Then Carl, can you do your trick? You should be able to now. Thank you.
So in many ways, one could perhaps say that I'm sidestepping the very broad and powerful question that Kenny put to us. But one way I would think about the theoretical purchase of world making is that perhaps one can say it inspires us to think about our archives differently, or at least it also connects to how I've been very much dedicated to alternative archives and thinking about archives as like technologies where we can see the activation of now lost forms of world making, perhaps. So just very briefly to situate us a little bit in Mombasa again. So around the 1920s, Mombasa was very much shaped along, I'm going to admit somebody since I'm now. So Mombasa in the 1920s was very much very much the high colonial period. The British had colonized much of East Africa, and colonial law institutions very much created a hierarchy marking everyone as either African and Arab, Asian, or European. Now, coastal communities have always fluctuated between being identified as African, Arab, or mixed natives, and that very much implicated also where people could live in Mombasa. And the elite of Mombasa, who self-identified, and sometimes the British let them self-identify as Arabs, very much tried to foreclose other people's access to categories of the non-native, or categories even of Arabness or Swahiliness. So we know from historians of the urban history of Mombasa, some of the most important scholars like Frederick Cooper and others, they very much focused on the way that identity became spatialized, and also how, the transformation of Mombasa with a huge influx of workers from South Asia, but also other parts of Kenya, especially mainland Kenya, completely transformed Mombasa. We understand how we can think about Mombasa as a city where massive labor revolutions were being shaped on the waterfront and the docks of Mombasa. And we can, scholars have used archives like the Colonial Archive to show how the British, though, constantly tried to force people into stable ethnic and racial groups. I've been dedicated, especially in my recent book on photography, in looking at alternative archives that are not accessible to, to historians really until recently, right? They don't connect to celebrated pasts or public historical consciousness. Like, for example, here's an archive of glass plate negatives, right? That look a little bit like this when you hold them to the light, right? They are the fragments, the remains that nobody is, that nobody has really any sense of even what to make of them, because they completely exceed and even, question how we have talked about 1920s and 1930s, or the Mombasa, or the high colonial period in Mombasa. For example, you can't racialize these, figures. You can't reuse established identitarian terms to make sense of these people. We can't even really fully identify them as whether they're Christian or a Muslim. So what I've been really dedicated to over the last couple of years is, unofficial archives, family archives, even archives that people themselves in Mombasa no longer know what to do with, like these, for example, right? And to me, these, of course, I'm an art historian, and one could, of course, as Kenny often does, accuse me of a romanticized formal reading of these photographs, right? But nonetheless, to me, there is a world-making project that has been completely forgotten, visible in the way that these people, these amazing young teenagers, take up space in Mombasa. I'll leave it at that.
Very good. Thank you, Preeta, for enlivening us also with some visual material. And I think in a way this is a response perhaps already to Micha's point about world making not being exactly a methodology. But as you suggest, Preeta, it does help us to think very specifically and concretely, for instance, about our archival strategies. And this goes back also to a conversation in the same series on archival futures that looked at and questioned, how we relate to archives in the city, and how that might lead us to think differently about global urban history. because I think in a way what you talk about with all three of you, this kind of placing and categorizing has been, you could say, a kind of implicit practice of many historians, and one that is not necessarily offset or decentered or dethroned by transnational history, which sometimes tends to veer into a kind of neo-imperialist history in terms of its epistemology, right? So I wonder if this idea of world making then can lead to specific methods of that urban historians can take up and take on. But it wasn't actually my job to speak here. This was now your time to respond to each other's prompts. So Kaisha, please.
Yes, and yeah, thank you, Preeta, for those images, because it also helps me to think about, and I think even going back to the map that you showed, makes me think also connected to, Michael's point about what is specific about urban history regarding these concepts. Looking at that map, it looks exactly like the map of Colón, City Colón, in terms of the actual mapping of the area. I was sort of blown away for a bit looking at it, because I thought this, and it makes me wonder how many other port cities, especially small ones, in the case of Colón, it's 16 city blocks, 8 avenues, right, with ample room for ports. How many actually look like this? And to what degree do you have a conversation about the making of the city, the physical mapping of it, connecting various port cities, right? Like who are the people creating it? So this is a bit of urban planning that I sort of got myself thinking about for a bit. But I think it's so instructive to then think about how the mapping and the planning of that city also affects where people can live, right? And what neighborhoods they have access to, what areas are ones where they can get involved in their trade, and so on and so forth. And so thinking about how particular areas of Panama City were carved out as being a bit more exclusive than others. Within Colón, you actually had the US occupy about a quarter of the city as its own colony for a while. And then that similar map and that similar mapping of communities being something that you see in the Canal Zone as a reality of how space is. There's an attempt at using space to limit how people can move, right? And to also delineate it in very specific ways. But people, of course, challenge that space, right? I'm thinking about even attempts at creating borders between the Canal Zone and Panama City and Colón, right? There was, for a while, there were no physical borders. You could walk in from Colón. Of course, you would still be policed, right? You would have to show identifications, et cetera. And then an effort to actually creating a barbed wire separation, right, between the zone and the city. And so it makes me think about under what circumstances do we see a physical attempt at demarcating a city and particular parts of that city as not belonging to particular communities, and how do people then make their way in nonetheless, right? It makes me think about contraband of how you sort of have people go in and out of spaces that they're told so they can't occupy and make something of those particular experiences, and connected to how we use archives. This reminds me a lot of the need to think about stories, right? Stories that are passed down in communities. This is how often stories, songs, right, that highlight people like those who were engaged in contraband, taking things out of the zone into Panama City. Also, stories and tales that came up to try to map out these communities that created their own songs that were not official anthems, but were nonetheless things that were known by various generations. So that idea of thinking beyond the very specific, what do you find in the government archives, which I think most historians have moved on from, to, and most scholars, period, to in what ways do you see iterations of challenges to, at times, physical, literal attempts at mapping out where people can and cannot live, to what actually is happening on the ground? And that's why it's so important to return to the particular. Because if we just look at the maps, if we just look at the reports, we would miss, right? Whether it is deposing, teenagers, we would miss the songs that are created about the zone. We would miss the constant conversations about contraband that are just from the top down, without realizing why there's, for example, a particular good being taken and sold elsewhere. So I like that invitation to look more extensively at what archives has been based on and what we've been engaging with for some time, and what it can do to actually push, I would say, like urban planning and urban thinking, because it's real, right? These historical accounts help us to also understand how cities are today, and what are the legacies that we have been passing down, perhaps without realizing that we are reconstructing some of these very same avenues of exclusion and inclusion.
Thanks so much, Michael.
Yeah, I'm not sure what to add or ask. This is a great discussion. A little bit similar to Kaisha, when I saw the map, it made me think of similar maps. And here in particular the question, right? So obviously map making, first of all, it has making in the word, like world making, right? But map making in critical cartography for a long time has been a standard staple of history. But also I think in global history more broadly, in critical cartography, how maps foment how people think about their world, be it a city or literally the world in the case of world maps, right? So they are, I think maps are a good example of fairly literal instances of world making, right? In that they convey to people how their worlds look. And in particular, these city maps of that differentiate between different communities, I think are a way in which the local city scale and the neighborhood interacts with much larger global maps that seek to chart and space the turf or land of different communities, right? I was thinking, and I just picked it out. If I can share my screen, Carl. It's a different map, right? But I teach a class on cities in the masters. And can I share this now? I don't think I can, but I can. But I can. Carl is the host now. Anyway, I can describe it. It's not super important, right? It's a map of Izmir in I think 1895, produced by a Greek map maker. It's a different map from yours in that it's a much more clearer topographical map, and then it doesn't demarcate ethnic neighborhoods with different colors, so they look less impermeable than they do in your case, right? So it's just a map of all the streets, and then on a top layer there's writing that goes Jewish quarter, Armenian quarter, Turkish quarter, Frank quarter, and so forth, right? But it's basically a map that conveys a measure of in this case ethnic segregation. And I show this map to my students and ask them, okay, now because we have a discussion about ethnic segregation in cities, but also about cosmopolitanism in cities, right? And port cities as being cosmopolitan, and all this literature which is in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the Ottoman case, I think, and but also in the Southeast Asian case, if you think of Sulin Louis and so forth. So I go into the class to show it to people and ask, okay, so now you tell me, is this a segregated city or is it a cosmopolitan city? And then because they see, Turkish quarter, Jewish quarter, and they go, Both. um, so I think it's an example of how a map can convey contradictory points, both of which, however, are about the interrelationship of people to land, and on a larger scale than the city, the world, I suppose. I don't know if that's a good example of urban world making, but when I saw the map, I thought it might be.
If I could just briefly, just, since I'm the devil who brought the map in, address some of the things that have been said. I mean, I brought, that in because I wanted to really emphasize the point that that map is in many ways really a colonialist, but also in many ways fictive attempt to, create a legible version of Mombasa to Europeans, to colonizers, to anchor a city that did not, urban residents that in fact oftentimes did not respect, quote unquote, the color line, that also were not respecting the segregationist line. Of course, although as the colonial period moved on, control of neighborhoods became more and more sort of intense and more segregated and racialized. But I want to emphasize that for me, what's interesting about reading archival materials against themselves is that they oftentimes contradict each other, or in fact demand that we focus on the way that I guess competing projects of world making suggest sort of a totalitarity in the archive that's just not there. Because if you compare let's say the photo archive of Muhammin in his house to the colonial archive represented by that map, they represent the same time period, but completely different realities, actually, or lived experiences. And, briefly about your point about port cities, of course, there's nothing more elitist than the category of cosmopolitanism. I would say all forms of cosmopolitanism are segregationist.
All right, very good answers to those points. I guess maybe on maps, just to add that I would think it would require also history, the circulation of those maps, and not only their production, right? In order to see how and if they influence how people thought about their worlds at a particular time. But we're 20 minutes or 19 actually from the end, and this is the time for questions from the audience. Mariana. Please go ahead, Mariana. Yes.
Oh, sorry, I didn't hear you call my name. I'm sorry. Okay, I'm going to ask a very selfish question of a personal interest. But as you're talking about urban spaces of world making, the thing that keeps coming back to my mind are theaters and cinemas and concert halls, and how these are places that create worlds. So it's a different kind of world making, but where people experience, participate, right, in the creation of these other worlds and experience them, and usually feel that they engage with broader worlds through these spaces. And so I was wondering if in your research you have explored like these particular urban spaces. And just as an anecdote, I had some few years ago a graduate student who worked on operas in colonial Cusco and wrote a dissertation about that. And one of the interesting things she explored is that when the sheet music came, right, to people in these colonial areas, the artists that were putting on these shows were either free Black or Indigenous people, right? And so they could read the sheet music, they could perform the music, but there would be these parts that had dance, right? There was just like some dance, right? And they had no idea what European dances were like. And so she was able to use accounts of the performances to show that the dances that they were dancing were very local, traditional ones, right? But it was this very interesting dynamic of people feeling they were participating in this world culture, right, and bringing the broader world to, right, the Andes, right, in the 16th, 17th century, and inserting Andean culture into this world, right, into this world view of this is what, you know, educated cosmopolitan theater looks like, and it looks very much like Andean culture. So I was wondering, like, I was always fascinated by this kind of conversation, right? And how the world can be recreated in a theatrical space or a cinema space. And these are very urban experiences, right? Because even in the early 20th century, people would go to cities, right, to participate in that experience. So anyway, I'll stop talking, but I was curious if this is something that any of you ever encountered in your research or thought about, if this could be another entry point to this question. Thanks.
Thanks for the question, Mariana. I don't know who feels most urged to first respond.
I'll jump in. Oh, are we going to?
No, you go.
I was going to say to keep the order going. But thank you so much for that question, Mariana. I too think it's really fascinating to think about how cities are spaces that people go to precisely because that's where the theater is at, that's where the spaces are at. So I, for example, look at like radio programs and radio offices that are created in particular cities because suddenly not only do you get to create a radio program like telenovelas, you know, radionovelas, right, through this space, but you get to communicate it more broadly. In addition to thinking about how it is in spaces like Colón and Panama City that you have the creation of things like calypso bands that take on Spanish and English, and as a result, create a new form, right? So a new form of music is created in these specific spaces and is only possible because of how the city has been constituted, right? So it is in particular venues in Colón, in Panama City, that you have people come together with their instrumental talents, vocal talents, and create something entirely new. Something that is borrowing certainly from big band, that is borrowing already from some of the calypso that is around the other parts of the Caribbean, from cumbia that is in parts of South America, and creating something that speaks to the very, very particular place. And so when you hear some of this music, you are kind of able to take yourself to a specific time and place because it sounds very much like something that could only have been created in Panama City or in Colón City, but nonetheless available for a broader world. And it would not have been created and possible if it were not for these extensive sort of periods of migration and the children of migrants who are in conversation with other people, other kinds of production, and creating it anew. So I found that, you know, music becomes one really important way of understanding how community and world making happens, in addition to just the radio, right, as a really transformative way of connecting people across who don't need literacy, right? You don't need literacy. It's much more accessible. All you need is to show up to these events, and they really become these spaces, especially in city hall plazas, where people cross class, cross ethnicity, cross race really come together. There's only that one theater space, or there's only that one venue. And as long as you can pay your way in, that's all you need, right? It's not really a matter of excluding. So creating something that is really unique to the space is one dimension, and the other is how these spaces also allow for people to come in contact and conversation in ways that even, you know, these imperialist map makers were not thinking about, right? These become sites where people are in conversation and creating and dancing, and you can see how much the elites hate this because they write about it in newspapers, right? There's a constant op-eds of like, oh, these people with their dancing and their loud talking, etc. And I'm like, well, this is working. This is the kind of world making in an everyday sense that for me is powerful.
If I can just briefly add, I mean, I love that question and also the response. And yes, in a very short answer would be to that cinema. You know, what's so fascinating about the port cities of the Swahili coast is that cinema becomes one of the most important spaces of sociality already, you know, in the late 19th century. And there's reports run by South Asians, by the way, by diasporic South Asians who bring, you know, cinema actually oftentimes from India to the Swahili coast. So you have cinemas that cater to hundreds of audiences at once. So think about that. That Zanzibar and Mombasa had these huge cinema houses that also similar to your point, Keisha, brought people from all over, also the hinterland, to you know, consume culture, but also to make it their own, right? And one of the interesting things is that to think of the city as a space of leisure and free time. And, you know, not to complicate the story of Swahili Coast cities too much for this audience, but, you know, we're talking about a post-abolition society at this point, right? So slavery, the afterlives of slavery were everywhere in colonial Mombasa, and of course, in many ways still now. So the power and the freedom to go to a cinema house or even to sit for one's portrait in a photography studio, you know, to, you know, sit as if you had the free time to look beautiful in a photograph or to have the free time to enjoy cinema, right? Leisure as freedom is absolutely essential. And the cities were the place for that.
Yeah, I completely agree. It should have come up earlier, right? I could add a lot of examples from 1920s Paris, where you may be less surprised to find them, right? Not so much about cinemas, but all sorts of other intrinsically urban venues that allow people to stage, in my case, anti-colonial activities. I don't know, right? So there's to give you one example, which becomes pretty important. There's a mutiny of Vietnamese soldiers in the French army in Vietnam, which is repressed in 1930, and then and this becomes a huge rallying thing for Vietnamese activists in Paris. And so they stage a theater play about this, which is actually partly targeting the Vietnamese community in Paris, but also targeting French interlocutors, which they need for all manners of things, right? Partly sometimes tied to the Human Rights League, whom they need when they get into legal trouble with French authorities, which happens quite often, right? And so it becomes very important for them which venue to choose, right? Because of what audience this can draw and so forth, and all these are very urban questions, right? Where do I go? Which neighborhood? How large is the thing? Which people normally come to this theater, or sometimes it's cafes, which is another form of sociability, right? Often in practice, it's linked to the communist, which owns these venues or finances or rents these venues, right? And all of this is a very urban dimension of how this activism works and who their interlocutors become and so forth. And a form of world making, right? Because the whole thing, the theater play, is partly designed. I mean, there's actually an exoticist undercurrent in it, in which Vietnamese anti-imperial activists try to draw in a French audience by, you know, playing with these cliches of Asian culture and so forth. Yeah, call it a form of world making, if you will, I guess. Yeah.
I love that point though about the, you know, the politics of consumption, far away things and cultures, or even like producing sort of like stereotypes in a particular way, or even reading stereotypes into what people are making of it. For example, what was a Kenyan thinking when he was watching a Bollywood movie, or she was watching a Bollywood movie, or even a Hollywood movie in 1930s Mombasa. One last point I wanted to make, that just Michael's comment reminded me, we oftentimes, one of the challenges of thinking, about global commodities or global media like cinema and photography, is that we as scholars who are interested in, let's say, to put it a little bit simplistically, in the local, oftentimes struggle to make sense of what, local meanings really are of these events, right? Or even the form of photography, I love the point that you made, Mariana, about that. Of course, you can more legibly, understand how a sheet music is transformed into a completely different dance, right? But with photography or cinema, the form is still legible to us in a certain way, and we sort of read into it a certain, similarity. Like oftentimes people read, sort of African photography, portrait photography, as being, all about, sort of like a autonomous subjecthood or modernity on a global scale. But we oftentimes, of course, misread the sort of the globality or the global components of the local production of culture.
I can just add one or two more examples, right? Because then I'll come back to me after a long time. So first of all, a lot of the West African and also Malagasy and Antillean activists that I look at in interwar parents, since in the entertainment industry, right? At the same time, it's Josephine, right, with whom they don't get on very well, because she's very pro-Mussolini when Italy invades Ethiopia and so forth. But it's a kind of it's tied to an economic niche which thrives on French fascination with black music. It's called Vogue Noire. And there's other things that, so for instance, certain Vietnamese economic niches that Vietnamese labor migrants, they do lacquer work. Is that the
yeah,
lacquer? Right, so they certain aircraft industry, but also furniture, and which is all about public and so forth. And then there's questions about their labor contracts and how Parisian ateliers recruit them under false pretenses from Vietnam, and whether this drives them to become anti-colonialists. And I won't get into it, but all of these are somewhat are somehow tied to questions of world making, if you will, right? As well as certain features specific to cities, right? You only have these ateliers in cities. You only have the theaters there. You only have the entertainment industry. Yeah.
Ayala, please. I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yeah, Ayala Levy. Hi, thank you everyone for this interesting discussion. As someone who does work on theater going in urban contexts, I'm particularly enjoying where we're going with this. But our conversation now also made me think of a point that Rita made not too long ago, which is that cosmopolitanism and segregation go hand in hand. And so maybe I can bring this back to the beginning of today's session, when Kaisha defined one of her ways of understanding world making was how her subject understood themselves as citizens of the world. How do you all see cosmopolitanism and this interpretation of world making as being distinct from one another or similar?
Fantastic question. We have 3 minutes to get to the bottom of this. Kaisha, you want to get started?
Sure, I'll dive in. And thank you so much for that question, Ayala. For me, the way that I conceptualize world making and that idea of, especially for teachers instructing students and consider themselves as citizens of the world, is quite different from a cosmopolitan approach where citizenship is already assumed. For me, cosmopolitanism assumes that you have access to it, you have access to mobility, you have that passport, right? You have those connections in a way that world making does not necessitate. You do not need a passport to engage in world making. You do not need to be identified as a citizen of a particular country to engage in world making. What it does require is often a need to counter a condition whereby your existence has been denied. Those that are taking on this terminology are doing so not just in reaction to, but because they need to construct something that goes beyond the very limited definitions of citizenship and belonging that they've been afforded. So I would say that distinction is the biggest, right? Access to actual citizenship and protection and invisibilizing, and why you then have to insert yourself into the world.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in the remaining minute we won't resolve the issue, right? So first of all, I think the term cosmopolitanism is being used very differently in different kinds of urban histories, partly depending on which world region we are in, right? So I don't know, in early 19th century Buenos Aires, people say it's, oh, this is a very cosmopolitan city, and people may repeat this point. What they mean is there's a lot of European immigrants from different nations, right? In the Eastern Mediterranean and the Southeast Asian context that I was talking about, I think there's been a resurgence of literature, and I'm thinking of in Louis, in the case of Southeast Asian, which puts cosmopolitanism in the title of their books and stresses these cities' cosmopolitanism and so forth, right? And I think it usually does so by advancing an argument, right, or the so-called plural society in Southeast Asia. Communal divisions were more permeable than the literature has made us believe, right? Or cities were not as segregated as historians have said, and so forth. So I think there it has a different meaning. I just threw this in the case of Izmir because I do think a little bit like Prita that, you know, yes, there are different degrees and kinds of segregation, of course, but the notion of cosmopolitan cities in the Eastern Mediterranean or Southeast Asia, which usually, you know, highlights communal interaction and the fuzziness of boundaries, the very notion of cosmopolitanism, yes, it's elitist, like Will Hanley said and so forth, but it's also premised on the identification of different communities, right? Which is usually along ethnic or racial or religious criteria rather than class, right? So nobody speaks of a cosmopolitan cities because you have rich and poor, right? So I think there's an element of distinction at the very least built into the notion of cosmopolitanism from the get-go. Yeah.
I think we're actually over time. You know, I would briefly just say, you know, in response to the question, but also, you know, a little bit not forgetting the question because we've had so many two wonderful responses. I think that one interesting aspect of, let's say, thinking specifically of, you know, port cities, you know, and the way that you can imagine you know, what world you belong to from the vantage point of a port city, but also of an archipelago or, you know, or in the case of, you know, other places like Panama, which of course also a port city, is that, you know, it always, it allows people to very much, you know, very concretely claim belonging to many worlds at once. And I'll just leave it at that.
Great. And with that, I think our time is up. And we didn't, of course, get to the bottom of any of this, but I hope it's made us think a bit more and will help some of you somehow. Then maybe finally, a little plug for our final event. Rosemary Wakeman has organized which takes place on the 5th of June and is entitled Critical Temporalities. All right, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, of course, to our wonderful speakers for making this such a lively event. And I hope to see many of you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.